That spring, Kris Kristofferson had 48 hours to finish an album. One song remained unwritten. He knew what it needed to be about, not because anyone asked, but because a letter had arrived 3 weeks earlier, and he'd been carrying the weight of not responding ever since. The letter itself was indirect. A mutual friend mentioned her name, said she'd asked about him, said she remembered that summer in '67 differently than he probably did. Said if he ever wanted to talk, she'd understand. The friend's tone suggested this wasn't an accusation. It was an opening. Kris read it twice. Then he filed it with other correspondence he told himself he'd answer when the tour settled. The tour never settled. Now he sat in a Nashville studio at 2 in the morning with musicians waiting and studio time ticking forward. He had a melody. He had a title that worked. What he didn't have was a clear recipient. The song was forming itself around someone, but the more he wrote, the less specific the details became. He was making it universal. That's what he told himself. He was doing what songwriters do, taking the personal and translating it into something a room full of strangers could feel without needing context. But there was a moment, just before he committed the first verse to tape, when he understood what he was actually doing. He was answering the letter. He was being completely honest, and he was making certain she'd never know it was meant for her. The relationship had ended in 1967 through a series of small disappearances. No fight, no betrayal, just the slow recognition that Kris was always about to leave for somewhere else, and she had stopped asking when he'd return. The last time they'd spoken, she hadn't seemed angry. She'd seemed resigned. That felt worse. Anger could be addressed. Resignation suggested she'd already worked through something he hadn't started processing. He remembered her saying, "You're going to write about this someday." Not as a threat, as an observation, like she was giving him permission to turn her into material. He'd wanted to argue that he wasn't that kind of writer, but they both knew he was. Every songwriter metabolizes their life into verses. It's what makes the work honest. It's also what makes certain conversations impossible. For 6 years, he hadn't written about her. Not directly. There were songs that borrowed her cadence, her way of pausing before saying something she'd thought through carefully. There were lines that referenced places they'd been without naming them, but nothing that would make her stop if she heard it on the radio and think, "That's me. That's us." Nothing that would require him to explain why he'd chosen to memorialize something he'd let dissolve. Then the letter arrived, and suddenly, the song he'd been avoiding had a deadline. The first verse came easily, too easily. It was about distance, about someone who understood you completely and chose not to follow, about the guilt of being the one who leaves and the strange relief when no one tries to stop you. He sang it through once for the band. The piano player nodded. The bass player asked if he wanted it mournful or reflective. Kris said reflective. Mournful would have been too obvious. The second verse was harder. It required him to admit something he hadn't fully articulated to himself, that he'd thought about reaching out a dozen times over the years and never had, that every time he'd come close, he'd convinced himself it would be selfish to reappear, that she'd moved on, that reopening contact would only serve his need for resolution, not hers, that the kindest thing he could do was let her remember him however she needed to, without complicating it with his version. All of that was true. None of it was complete. What he didn't write into the second verse, what he arranged the words carefully around, was the part where not reaching out had also protected him. From what exactly he couldn't name. But there was something about the finality of silence that felt safer than the uncertainty of conversation. If he never called, he never had to hear that she'd been fine without him, that the whole thing had mattered less than he'd needed it to, that his absence had been easy to absorb. So the second verse became about memory instead of contact, about how people shape each other and then carry that shape forward even when the person is gone. It was true enough. It scanned well. The melody supported it. When he sang it for the engineer said it felt honest. Kris nodded. He didn't correct him. The bridge almost broke the whole thing open. Bridges are meant to escalate, to take the song somewhere it hasn't been yet. For a moment, Kris considered writing the line he'd been avoiding. "I could have called. I didn't. I don't know why." simple, direct. The kind of admission that would make the song undeniable. He tried it, sang it through. The band stopped playing, not because it was bad, because it was too much. The piano player looked up, waiting. The silence stretched. Kris shook his head and said he'd try something else. What he wrote instead was about how some things are better left as questions, about how reaching out sometimes does more damage than staying away, about respecting someone's peace even when it costs you your own. Philosophically sound, defensible, the kind of sentiment that sounds wise until you realize it's a justification. The band didn't stop this time. They leaned into it. The bridge built the way bridges should, added weight, shifted tone, then returned to the chorus with new meaning. When they finished the take, the engineer said that was the one. Kris agreed. He didn't mention that he'd replaced confession with conclusion, that he'd taken the moment the song could have been about her specifically and turned it into a meditation anyone could project onto. It worked. That was the problem. It worked too well. Afterward, alone in the control booth, while the engineer mixed levels, Kris listened to the playback. The song held together. It had the shape of honesty without the consequences. Someone could hear it and think he was baring his soul. Someone else could hear it and apply it to their own lost connection. That's what made it universal. That's what would make it a standard. But if she heard it, if the mutual friend played it for her, or if she happened to catch it on the radio, would she recognize herself? Or would the careful vagueness he'd built into every verse make her think it was about someone else? Something else. He realized he didn't know which outcome he wanted. If she recognized herself, it would be an answer. A delayed one, wrapped in metaphor, but an answer. It would say, yes, I remember. Yes, it mattered. Yes, I've been carrying this. But it would also raise the question of why he'd chosen to respond this way, publicly, indirectly, in a form that required her to translate his feelings through 3.5 minutes of melody and craft. It would confirm that he was exactly the kind of person she'd resigned herself to understanding, someone who processes through art instead of conversation. If she didn't recognize herself, the song could still do its work. It would exist. It would be honest in the way songs are honest, true to a feeling without being true to the facts. Other people would claim it. It would mean something to them. And he would have answered the letter in the only way he knew how, even if the answer never reached her. Both options felt like failures, but only one required follow-up. The album released that summer. The song became a single, not a massive hit, but steady. The kind of track that gets played at the end of nights when people are ready to feel something they've been avoiding. Reviews called it achingly vulnerable and devastatingly honest. One critic wrote that it felt like Kristofferson had finally stopped performing and started confessing. Kris read that review twice. He didn't call to correct it. The song found its audience. People wrote him letters about it, long, handwritten letters explaining what it meant to them, who they thought of when they heard it, why it had arrived at exactly the right moment in their lives. He read every one. Some he answered. Most he filed away with other correspondence he told himself he'd respond to when things settled. None of the letters were from her. He didn't know if that meant she hadn't heard it, or if she'd heard it and chosen not to respond, or if she'd heard it and hadn't recognized herself in the careful universality he'd constructed. Each possibility suggested a different kind of closure. None of them felt complete. 6 months later, he played a small venue in Texas. After the show, someone approached him at the bar, a woman about his age, traveling through, saw his name on the marquee and decided to stay. They talked for an hour about nothing significant. Music they'd both heard, roads they'd both traveled, the way certain years feel longer in memory than they were in real life. She mentioned the song, said it had helped her let go of something she'd been holding on to, said she'd written a letter to someone after hearing it, then decided not to send it, said sometimes the act of writing it was enough, that putting it into words made it real, even if no one else read them. Kris nodded. He understood exactly what she meant. Before she left, she asked if the song was about someone specific. He paused, not because he didn't know the answer, but because he was deciding which version to give. He could tell her yes, it was. He could tell her it was about a composite of people and moments. He could tell her that all songs are about someone, even when they're about everyone. What he said was, it's about not knowing when to reach out and when to let go. She smiled, said that made sense, said she was glad he'd written it. Then she was gone, and he was left with the same question he'd been carrying since the studio, whether honesty requires specificity or whether being true to a feeling is enough. The mutual friend reached out again a year later. Brief note. Said she'd run into her, said she was doing well, said she'd mentioned hearing the song, said she thought it was beautiful, said nothing else. Kris read the note 3 times, looking for subtext. Was beautiful a acknowledgement, a deflection, a way of saying I know and I'm letting you off easy? Or had she genuinely heard it as a song, a well-crafted piece of work that moved her the way songs do, without personal implication? He wanted to ask. He didn't. Instead, he wrote back to the mutual friend, kept it light, said he was glad she liked it, said he hoped she was well, said if she ever wanted to talk, he'd be around. Then he read what he'd written and realized he'd done it again, offered an opening so carefully worded it could be ignored without consequence. He sent it anyway. No response came. Which was also a kind of response. Years passed. The song stayed in rotation. It became one of those tracks people discovered late, usually through covers or compilations. Each new version added distance. Other voices sang his words. Other arrangements shifted the emotional weight. The song kept working. It kept meaning something. Kris performed it occasionally, usually toward the end of sets when the audience had settled into listening instead of reacting. He never introduced it with context. Never said, this one's about. He just counted in and let the band follow. There was a moment in the second verse, the one he'd rewritten to avoid confession, where he still felt the pull of the original line. I could have called. I didn't. I don't know why. Sometimes, mid-performance, he'd consider singing it, just once, just to see what it felt like to say it out loud instead of working around it. He never did. Not because he'd forgotten, but because the song had become something else by then. It wasn't about her anymore. Or it wasn't only about her. It had absorbed other departures, other silences, other moments when he'd chosen distance over difficulty. The song had grown large enough to contain all of it without requiring him to specify which parts were about whom. That's what songwriting does. It takes the specific and makes it universal. It's a gift, the ability to be completely honest without being entirely transparent, to confess without naming what you're confessing to answer without being held accountable for the answer. But it's also a kind of escape. In 1988, during a retrospective interview, a journalist asked about the song, wanted to know the story behind it, said fans had been speculating for years about who it was about, said there were theories. Kris smiled, said he couldn't remember exactly, said it came together fast, said sometimes songs write themselves and you're just the person holding the pen. All true, none of it complete. The journalist pushed gently, said the specificity of certain lines suggested a real moment, a real person. Kris nodded, said sure, everything comes from somewhere, but that the act of turning life into song requires transformation, that you can't just transcribe experience, you have to shape it into something that works musically, emotionally, structurally. That process changes what the song is about, makes it bigger than the initial impulse. The journalist wrote that down, seemed satisfied, moved on to the next question. Kris watched him write, thought about the letter, still filed somewhere in a box he hadn't opened in years, thought about the song he'd written instead of responding, thought about all the people who'd claimed it as their own, who'd heard their story in his words, who'd found meaning he hadn't consciously intended. He'd given them something real, something that mattered, something honest. Just not the specific honesty they thought they were hearing. The last time he performed the song was in the mid-90s, small theater, intimate crowd, the kind of venue where silence feels intentional. He was older by then. His voice had weathered. The song sounded different, less about yearning, more about acceptance. Time had done to his performance what it does to all memory, softened the edges, made the pain feel distant enough to examine. Midway through the second verse, he caught himself almost smiling. Not at the audience, at the song itself. At the fact that it outlived the moment that created it, that it had become permanent, while the relationship it referenced, or didn't reference depending on how you looked at it, had dissolved into something he could barely reconstruct. He finished the song. The audience sat with it for a moment before applauding. That pause, that breath between the final note and the response, felt like recognition, like they understood he'd given them something true, even if they didn't know what truth they were receiving. Afterward, backstage, someone asked if he still played it because people requested it or because it still meant something to him. Kris thought about it, said both. Said songs take on their own life after a while. Said you can't control what they become. The person nodded. Said it must be strange, performing something so personal night after night. Kris almost corrected them, almost said the personal part wasn't what they thought. That the song was personal, yes, but personal in its evasion, not its confession. That the most honest thing about it was what he'd carefully chosen not to say. Instead, he said, you get used to it. The letter itself, the one that started everything, remained filed in a box in a storage unit in Nashville. Kris thought about retrieving it once, during a move. Decided against it. Not because he didn't want to remember, but because he already did. And remembering on his own terms, without the specificity of rereading her friend's exact words, felt the song existed. That was his response. Whether it reached her or not, whether she recognized herself or not, whether it answered what she'd been asking or not, those outcomes were beyond his control. He'd done what he knew how to do. He'd taken something complicated and shaped it into something beautiful. He'd been honest in the way artists are honest, true to the feeling, protective of the facts. It wasn't resolution, but it was something. And maybe that was the point. Maybe the act of writing it, of sitting in that studio at 2 a.m. and choosing carefully which details to include and which to obscure, had been the real answer. Not to her question, but to his. The question he'd been carrying since the relationship ended, whether it was possible to acknowledge something without confronting it, to honor something without resurrecting it, to be vulnerable without being exposed. The song proved it was. It just required accepting that the people listening would never know what they were really hearing. In the years that followed, Kris wrote other songs, lived other lives, had other conversations he didn't follow up on, other letters he meant to answer, other moments when he chose craft over confession. Each time it got easier, not because the feelings were less real, but because he'd established a pattern, a way of being honest that protected him from the consequences of honesty. The song remained, covered by other artists, included in films, played at weddings and funerals, and moments when people needed to feel their own version of loss. It meant something to thousands of people who would never know where it came from, who would never know about the letter, the studio deadline, the careful rewrites that turned specificity into universality. That was the gift and the cost. Because somewhere, Kris never knew where, never tried to find out, she existed. Maybe she'd heard the song. Maybe she'd recognized the shape of what he'd been trying to say beneath what he'd actually written. Maybe she'd understood that this was his way of answering. Or maybe she'd heard it the way everyone else did, as a beautiful meditation on distance and memory, crafted by someone who understood longing without necessarily having experienced it firsthand. He would never know which, and that was by design. Late in life, when interviewers asked about legacy, about which songs would outlast him, which ones captured something permanent, Kris rarely mentioned that particular track. Not because it wasn't good, but because explaining why it mattered would require explaining what it was really about. And he'd spent decades making sure that explanation was unnecessary. The song stood on its own. That's what mattered. It worked without context. It moved people without requiring them to know who the people were or what actually happened or why he'd chosen a recording session over a phone call. It was honest, carefully, protectively, permanently honest. Just not in the way anyone listening would guess. And if she ever wondered, if she ever sat with the song and thought, was that meant for me, she would have to live with the same uncertainty he'd lived with since he wrote it. The space between recognition and confirmation. The place where meaning exists without verification. He'd given her the song. He'd never given her the answer. That was the moment he'd chosen intellect over exposure, craft over clarity. The safety of metaphor over the risk of direct address. It wasn't a collapse. It wasn't redemption. It was just a choice, made quietly, executed carefully, sustained indefinitely. The song existed. The letter went unanswered. Life continued. And somewhere in the gap between what he'd written and what he'd meant, the truth remained. Understood by him, offered to her, heard by everyone else. Perfectly honest, perfectly withheld. These stories are disappearing. There are very few places left that tell Kris Kristofferson this way. If you don't want to lose another one,